Some people retire to Florida. Ruth Kaner bought a ruin. She was 68 years old, widowed, and tired of living inside other people's walls. The cabin cost her $13,500 less than a decent used truck, and she had wired the money to a county escrow account without ever setting foot on the property. Just a single photograph on a government auction website, a listing price marked down 3 times from a starting bid nobody wanted, and something she could not explain, pulling at the center of her chest like a fishhook. She had swallowed long ago and only just now felt. The drive from Staunton took 2 hours and 40 minutes, the last 40, on roads that got progressively worse until the pavement ended entirely, and the GPS on her phone gave up with a small defeated chime somewhere around the Third Creek crossing. She navigated by the printed directions she had made herself old habit from 40 years of leading search and rescue teams through terrain that had swallowed better equipped people than her. Past the collapsed stone wall, left at the 2-headed oak. Watch for the drop after the second switchback. She found it without getting lost, which she took as a good sign. Ruth Kaner had always been better in the wilderness than anywhere else. The cabin sat at the end of an unmarked dirt track cradled in a shallow clearing where the forest pulled back just enough to let the sky in. She stopped the truck at the edge of the clearing and left the engine running while she looked. The roof sagged along the center ridge like a spine that had taken too many hard years. 2 windows on the east face were boarded with plywood gone gray and soft with moisture. A 3rd window had simply collapsed inward, leaving a dark rectangular hole like a missing tooth. The porch, which ran the full width of the front face, listed badly to the left, its support posts rotted at the base to the diameter of broomsticks. The chimney was intact but darkly stained, and the entire structure had settled unevenly into the mountain soil until it leaned with a kind of exhausted dignity like a very old man who refused to sit down. 1 bad winter, maybe 2 if the winter was merciful. Ruth had spent 4 decades in Shenandoah National Forest reading structures the way other people read faces, and what she read here was a building that had been loved once, then abandoned, and was now in the slow process of returning itself to the mountain. Another 10 years and the trees would have it. The forest was patient that way. It always took back what it was owed. She sat with the engine ticking and thought about the apartment in Staunton. 3 rooms on the 2nd floor of a building that smelled permanently of other people's cooking. Thin walls, a parking lot view, a lease she renewed automatically because she had never gotten around to wanting anything different. She had lived there for 11 years, ever since Jack died, and the house they had shared in Harrisonburg became a place she could not make herself stay in. The apartment was not a home. It was a waiting room. She had been sitting in it for 7 years without knowing what she was waiting for. She turned off the engine and got out. The air hit her immediately, cool and sharp, even in June, carrying pine resin and creek water, and the specific clean silence that only exists above 3,000 feet. Her boots sank slightly into soft ground layered with decades of fallen needles, rust brown and deep. Somewhere to the south she could hear running water, a branch creek fed by snowmelt from the higher peaks, still running strong this late in the season. A woodpecker worked steadily somewhere in the tree line, the sound carrying across the clearing with the particular clarity that comes with elevation. Ruth breathed in slowly. Something in her chest that had been tight for 7 years loosened just slightly, like a knot that had been pulled so long it had forgotten how to release. She went to the porch. The steps groaned under her weight but held. The front door was unlocked. The estate auction paperwork had noted that the lock mechanism was non-functional, which Ruth had taken to mean broken, and which actually meant gone entirely. The hardware stripped out and the hole roughly plugged with a wad of newspaper dated November 1989. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, the swollen wood scraping against the frame, and stepped inside. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. Mildew and old wood and mouse, and beneath all of that something else, something harder to name, the particular scent of a space that had been closed off from living for so long that it had become something other than a room. Not decay exactly, more like held breath, like a place that had been waiting. Ruth stood in the doorway and let her vision settle. The main room was chaos organized by time. Furniture had been shoved against the walls or piled in the center, without pattern. A wooden table with 2 legs missing, 3 kitchen chairs stacked sideways. A leather armchair with the stuffing erupting from 3 separate wounds in its surface. Cardboard boxes lined the walls 3 and 4 deep. Most of them collapsed or split open, their contents spilled across the floorboards. Old magazines, canning jars clouded with decades-old contents. Tools gone to rust. A child's boot single sitting alone in the center of the floor like a punctuation mark. The walls were bare board, the wood water stained in long vertical streaks where the roof had leaked across many seasons. A stone fireplace dominated the north wall, its mantle thick with dust and holding nothing. To the right, a narrow hallway led into darkness. To the left, an open doorway showed the edge of what had been a kitchen. Ruth counted 3 other rooms beyond the main space. She set her backpack down carefully near the door and began to walk the cabin the way she had walked 10,000 miles of backcountry trail, slowly, deliberately reading the ground before committing weight to it. She tested each floorboard before stepping. She checked the ceiling joists through the gaps in the plaster. She pressed her palm flat against the structural walls and felt for the give that meant rot had reached the bones. The bones were good. Whoever had built this place had built it with the intention that it would outlast him. The floor joists were hand-hewn, not milled, old-growth timber that had dried to a density modern lumber would never reach. The stone fireplace had been laid by someone who understood how to set a foundation. The mortar was crumbling at the surface, but the structure beneath was solid as the mountain itself. The roof was failing, yes, but failing from the outside in. The sheathing boards rotted and the shingles long gone, while the underlying frame still held true. This was not a building someone had thrown up. This was a building someone had thought about, had planned, had made with the understanding that good work was its own argument against time. Ruth stood in the center of the main room and felt something move through her that she could not immediately name. Not recognition exactly. She had never been to this part of Virginia, had never been to this ridge, had no family history she knew of in the Blue Ridge. But something in the proportions of the room, something in the way the light fell through the south-facing window, created a sensation like a word on the tip of the tongue, familiar in shape without being identifiable in content. She shook it off and went to work. Ruth Kaner had not spent 40 years in the wilderness by paying too much attention to feelings she could not explain. She got out her notebook and her flashlight and began a systematic assessment room by room, noting structural condition, water damage, what could be salvaged and what could not. The kitchen had a hand pump sink that would need complete replacement, a wood-burning cook stove with a cracked firebox, and cabinets whose shelves still held stacks of newspapers from 1952 and 1953, their headlines preserved in the dry mountain air with eerie clarity. The smallest bedroom was nearly empty, a child's dresser, 1 drawer missing, and a wooden rocking chair with a broken runner positioned near the window, as if someone had placed it there deliberately to face the view. The second bedroom held a metal frame bed with a ruined mattress. The third was impassable, packed floor to ceiling with boxes and cast-off furniture and rolled rugs gone black with mold. It was in the main room, working her way back toward the door, that Ruth found the armchair. She had passed it on the way in without paying it much attention. Now she examined it more carefully. Despite the damage to its surface, the frame was solid hardwood, hand-jointed with wooden pegs rather than nails or screws. Someone had made this chair by hand with real craft. She tilted it back to check the legs and heard something shift inside the seat cushion. She worked her fingers into the gap between the cushion and the frame. Inside, caught in the springs, was a small brown envelope, its paper so brittle that it cracked slightly at her touch. Ruth carried it to the doorway where the light was better, and opened it with the care she used for things that could not be repaired if she damaged them. Inside was a photograph. Black and white, 3 inches by 4, the image faded but clear. A young woman stood on what was unmistakably this porch, the window frame visible behind her right shoulder. The woman was perhaps 24 years old, with dark hair pulled back simply from a face that held a particular quality Ruth recognized without being able to immediately name something between shyness and certainty. The expression of someone who knew exactly where she was and was still deciding what she thought about it. She wore a plain cotton dress with small buttons down the front. Her hands were clasped loosely in front of her, and pinned in her hair just above her left ear was a small silver brooch, a cluster of 5-petaled flowers with a round center, delicate and precise and unmistakably handmade. Ruth's hands went still. She knew that brooch. Not a brooch like it. Not a similar one. That brooch, the exact one with the small bent petal on the lower left where it had been repaired, was sitting in a green velvet box in the top drawer of Ruth's dresser in the apartment in Staunton. It had been among her mother's things when her mother died in 2018. Ruth had kept it without knowing why, without knowing anything about it, because her mother had kept it without ever explaining it. And Ruth had not known the right questions to ask. She turned the photograph over. The handwriting on the back was faded but legible, written in pencil with the careful script of someone who had been taught penmanship in a school that took it seriously. Ada, June 1952. First summer on the ridge. Ada. Her mother's name. Her mother's name written in her mother's handwriting. Her mother, who had been born in 1928 in Corvallis, Oregon, and had lived her entire life as far as Ruth had ever known in the Pacific Northwest, who had never mentioned Virginia, who had never mentioned the Blue Ridge, who had never mentioned a summer in 1952 on a ridge whose name was written here as though it were home. Ruth sat down on the porch steps because her legs had stopped being entirely reliable. She sat there for a long time holding the photograph, listening to the woodpecker in the creek and the wind moving through the upper canopy, while something that had always been the shape of her life quietly rearranged itself into a different shape entirely. Her mother had been here, in this cabin, in the summer of 1952, which was 4 years before Ruth was born, in January 1956. Her mother had stood on this porch and called it home. And she had never told Ruth, not in the 68 years of a life shared in the particular close way that a daughter and a widowed mother share a life, holidays and phone calls, and the slow management of aging, all of it conducted without one word about a summer on a Virginia ridge. She was still sitting there when she heard the truck. It came up the dirt track at the unhurried pace of someone who had driven it many times before, an old Ford pickup that had started its life dark green and was now the color of old moss. It stopped behind Ruth's truck and a man got out. He was perhaps 74, built with the stocky solidity of someone who had worked outdoors his whole life, wearing canvas work pants and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cool air. He moved with a slight hitch in his right hip but covered ground steadily. The walk of a man who had learned to work around the complaint rather than stop for it. He raised a hand as he came across the clearing. "Saw a truck I didn't know," he said. "Figured I'd come up." "Ruth Kaner," Ruth said, standing. "I bought this property." He looked at the cabin with the frank assessment of someone who had watched it deteriorate for years. "Harlan Duff," he said. "Live about 2 miles down the fire road. You've got your work cut out. I've seen worse. He looked at her the way people look at someone who has just said something they want to believe but aren't sure about yet. Then something in her face must have settled it, because he nodded slightly and said, "You want to know about the place?" It wasn't a question. Ruth said, "I want to know everything." They sat on the porch steps together while the afternoon light moved through the clearing, and Harlan Duff told her what he knew. He had moved to this part of the Blue Ridge in 1991, and the cabin had been empty for years before that. But the old-timers in the valley had talked the way old-timers always talked about things that had ended badly. There had been a community here, he said, a collective. 7 families who had pooled their resources and bought a parcel of mountain land in 1951, intending to live cooperatively, grow their own food, raise their children away from what one of them had apparently called the machinery of conformity. The man who had organized it, who had drawn up the agreements and built most of the structures and been the center of what Harlan described as a genuine attempt at something different, was a carpenter named Owen Mercer. The community had lasted 4 years. In the winter of 1955, there had been a confrontation. A man had been shot and killed. The federal government had been involved. This was the McCarthy era, and a group of people living communally and talking about shared resources had attracted the kind of attention that ruined lives in that decade. The other families had dispersed overnight, scattering to other states, changing their circumstances, if not always their names. Owen Mercer had not left. He built a place about 4 miles north of here, Harlan said. Lived there alone all those years. He paused, looking at the cabin wall, and something moved behind his eyes that Ruth recognized as the particular weight of having known someone's solitude without being able to do anything about it. Passed away a few years back, 102 years old, stubborn as the mountain itself. Ruth was quiet for a moment. He never had a family. Harlan looked at her. Not that I ever saw. After he left with an offer to help with anything heavy and directions to the hardware store in Waynesboro that she should trust over the one closer in, Ruth went back inside with a different kind of attention. She was a trained observer. She had spent 40 years noticing things that didn't belong and things that should have been there and weren't. She moved through the cabin now with her notebook in her back pocket and her flashlight in her hand, and the photograph tucked carefully in the front breast pocket of her shirt. People kept secrets. Ruth understood this. She had worked search and rescue long enough to know that the stories families told about themselves were almost never the whole story, that the gaps and omissions were often the most important parts. But this was not a small gap. This was not an omission. This was an entire chapter of a life hidden so completely that not even the chapter's existence had been hinted at. She worked the smallest bedroom last. It was the room that had felt most inhabited despite its emptiness. The child's dresser, the rocking chair, the window with its view of the clearing and the tree line beyond. Ruth got down on her knees and ran her flashlight along the baseboard where the wall met the floor, checking for water intrusion. In the far corner, the beam caught something that her eye processed a half-second before her brain caught up a section of baseboard that was slightly lighter than the wood around it. A difference in color consistent with handling, rather than weathering, the kind of variation that comes from a surface being touched repeatedly over many years. She pressed her fingers against the board and felt it give fractionally. She worked her thumbnail into the gap at the top edge and pulled. The board came away cleanly, revealing a hollow space between the wall studs, perhaps 8 inches wide and a foot deep. Inside was a book. Leather-covered, hand-stitched, the binding darkened with age to the color of old tobacco. Ruth lifted it out with both hands, the way you lift something you understand to be fragile and irreplaceable, and carried it to the rocking chair by the window. She opened it to the first page. The date read April 12, 1951. and the handwriting, that careful, precise penmanship, slightly right-leaning with the particular loop on the lowercase g that Ruth had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the notes her mother had left on the kitchen counter for 40 years was her mother's. Unmistakably, completely her mother's. Ruth sat in the rocking chair with the broken runner and read. The early entries were the voice of a woman Ruth had never known, or had known and not recognized, because this woman was young and unguarded and full of a specific kind of hope that does not survive most of what life does to people. Ada Brennan, 23 years old, newly arrived on a mountain in Virginia, writing about the smell of fresh-cut timber and the sound of an owl she heard every night from the east, and the extraordinary sensation of being exactly where she had chosen to be. She wrote about the others, the 7 families, their various skills and temperaments, and the daily negotiations of people learning to live at close quarters with shared purposes. She wrote about the gardens they were laying out, and the second cabin going up, and the way the community's children had already formed into a feral pack that ran the tree line from dawn to dusk, without apparent adult supervision or injury. And she wrote about Owen Mercer. Not immediately, not in the first pages. He appeared at first in passing mentioned as the man who had organized the land purchase, who knew how to read a watershed and set a foundation, who had a way of resolving disagreements before they became arguments. Practical details. The kind of notes you make about the competent person who makes things run without fanfare. But by the 5th entry, something had shifted in the writing. A quality of attention that Ruth recognized the way you recognize a change in light. Not the source of the light itself, but the way it falls differently. By the 10th entry, his name appeared 3 times per page. He had hands that knew what they were doing. He explained things without condescension. He had built the fireplace in this cabin from stones he had pulled from the creek himself, had set each one by hand, and when Ada asked why he was so particular about the placement, he had said that a fireplace was the heart of a house, and you didn't rush the heart. He had said it without self-consciousness, the way a person says something true. Ruth read for 2 hours without moving from the rocking chair. The broken runner meant the chair sat unevenly tilted slightly left, and she was dimly aware of the ache developing in her lower back, but she did not move. Outside the window, the light changed from afternoon to early evening, the shadows going long, and the sky deepening through the trees to a blue that had some purple in it. She read about a summer and then a fall, about the first harvest and the first difficult winter, and the way that difficulty had changed the community, some people revealing themselves more fully under pressure, and some people revealing things they would have preferred to keep hidden. She read about a man named Dale Pruitt. I was not a bad man at the start, Ada had written, or if he was, the badness was hidden well enough that no one saw it. He was skilled with his hands, and he worked hard, and he had 2 children who ran with the pack in the tree line and seemed perfectly happy. But when the drinking got worse in the second winter, the temper came out. Not toward his family, or not that Ada witnessed, but outward toward the idea of threat. He was afraid, she wrote, and when Dale Pruitt was afraid, he looked for something to be angry at instead. The federal agents had come for the first time in the spring of 1953. They had come the way such men came in that decade, in unmarked cars, in pairs, with the particular bureaucratic courtesy that is more frightening than overt threat because it implies paperwork process. The machinery of the state engaged against you in ways you cannot argue with in the street. They asked questions about affiliations and associations and what certain words meant when certain people used them. They took notes. They came back. Dale Pruitt had screamed at them the 3rd time, had used the word rights 11 times in 4 minutes. Ada had counted, and the agents had listened with the patient expressions of men who had heard this before, and found it neither persuasive nor particularly relevant. Owen had stood between Dale and the agents, and been quietly furious in a way that did not show on his face, Ada wrote. And then in the fall of 1954, the entries changed. The writing became compressed, the sentences shorter, the margin between what was written and what was felt growing smaller, as if the pressure of events was forcing them together. There were weeks in late 1954 when Ada had not written at all. When the entries resumed, they were different in quality, not the voice of a woman recording the texture of her days, but the voice of someone trying to get facts down before she forgot them, or lost the ability to record them. And then, without warning, in the final entry of November 1954, a section of approximately 15 pages had been torn from the binding. Not cut. Torn, quickly, not carefully, the ragged edges still showing the violence of the removal. What remained after the gap, a single entry, undated in handwriting that was her mother's, but shaken the letters uneven in a way Ruth had never seen in anything her mother had written. It said, "Dale is dead. Owen has been taken. I cannot wait until morning. I have to go tonight. I am carrying everything that matters." And then nothing. Ruth sat in the failing light with the journal in her lap and the photograph in her pocket, and the peculiar sensation of a person who has been reading a story and has just realized they are a character in it. Her mother had been here. Her mother had loved someone here, a man named Owen Mercer, who had built this cabin from creek stones and old-growth timber, and had said that a fireplace was the heart of a house. Something terrible had happened in late 1954. Her mother had run pregnant, carrying a child she would deliver alone in Oregon 2 months later in January 1956. That child was Ruth, and the man her mother had run from or run away, leaving behind, had stayed in these mountains for the rest of a very long life, had died here in 2021 at the age of 102, had lived alone on this mountain for 67 years after the night Ada Brennan packed whatever she could carry and disappeared into the dark. Ruth looked up from the journal and out through the window at the clearing going dark, the tree line now, just a mass of black against a sky holding the last gray light of day. She thought about what Harlan Duff had said. "Not that I ever saw. 102 years old and no family, 67 years alone on a mountain. A man who had organized a community of people who believed in the idea of living together, who had built 7 structures with his own hands, who had written about wanting a house to be a home, and who had ended his days alone 4 miles north of the cabin he had built for a life that had been taken from him in a single night." Ruth thought about the torn pages. They had been torn out. They had not been destroyed. In Ruth's experience, a person who destroys evidence destroys it completely. A person who tears something out but cannot bring themselves to destroy it is a person who could not let it go entirely, who needed it somewhere even if they could not bear to see it, which meant the pages were somewhere. She got up from the rocking chair, her back protesting the hours of sitting in an uneven position, and went back to the kitchen with her flashlight. She had checked the obvious places already. Now she thought about the logic of someone who could not destroy something but could not leave it visible. Someone systematic. Someone who had been a school teacher, which meant someone who understood that information was valuable, and that valuable things were best kept in places with more than one purpose. She found them 40 minutes later, rolled tightly and inserted into the hollow space inside the iron pipe that served as the wood stove's secondary flue connection, a pipe that was never used, that served no current function. That was in fact the wrong diameter for the stove it was attached to, as if it had been installed not for its functional purpose, but for its concealment purpose. Ruth unrolled the pages carefully on the kitchen table, flattening them with gentle pressure from her palms. She read what her mother had hidden. The pages covered the final weeks of 1954. Days of increasing pressure of agents who came more frequently and asked questions that had become less polite of Dale Pruitt, who had been drinking from the moment he woke up and had stopped sleeping entirely, of Owen, who was holding everything together through the force of a steadiness that Ada could see was costing him. And then the night of November 28th, 1954. What had happened on the night of November 28th, 1954, was not what the newspapers had reported. Ruth knew this before she finished reading the second page. The newspapers had said what the federal government wanted said, which was a version of events that protected the agents involved and ended the story in a way that could not be appealed. What Ada had written was different. Dale Pruitt had not been shot by the federal agents. Dale Pruitt had been shot by another member of the collective, a man named Warren Foss, who had been afraid for his family, who had seen Dale advance on the agents with his rifle raised and had acted in the half-second before he could think about acting. Warren Foss had fired once. Dale Pruitt had died before he reached the ground. The federal agents had been there. They had seen everything, and in the chaos of the next hour they had made a calculation that the story of a government agent shooting a man who had technically been threatening them was cleaner, more defensible, less likely to unravel on them than the true story, which involved questions they did not want asked about why they were there at all and what authority they actually had. They had told Warren Foss what the story would be. They had arrested Owen Mercer, who had been standing between everyone and had touched every person present, trying to stop what was coming, because arresting the organizers served their purposes regardless of what had actually happened. They had made it clear to everyone within earshot that the version of events that protected them was the version that would be told, and that the alternative was a legal process that would take years and end badly for all of the people who could not afford lawyers. Ada had written it all down, every detail, every name, and then she had written a single line beneath the account. "I cannot let them find this. I cannot let them find what I am carrying." Ruth read that line twice. Her mother had been 4 months pregnant when she fled. 4 months along with the child she would name Ruth, born in a rented room in Eugene, Oregon, on January 14th, 1956. 14 months after the night everything broke apart on Harlan Ridge. She turned back to the beginning of the hidden pages, to the first entry in the sequence. There, written in a hand slightly more controlled than the later entries, was a passage she would read many times in the weeks that followed. "I told Owen last week. He took both my hands and held them for a long time without speaking, and when he finally looked up, his face had the expression I have only seen on him once before, the day the first cabin was finished, and we stood in the doorway together and understood that we had made something real. He wants to build a room. He has already started drawing plans. He says the walls should be white. That white makes a room feel like it belongs to the person in it, rather than to the house around them." Ruth Kaner sat in the dark kitchen of the cabin her father had built and understood, finally, in the wordless way that the most important understandings arrive exactly where she was. George Kaner, the quiet pharmacist from Corvallis, who had been patient and steady and had never once spoken of the years before he met Ada, who had died of a heart attack at 61, and whom Ruth had grieved with the specific grief of losing something you valued without ever fully understanding. George Kaner was not her father. Owen Mercer was her father. Owen Mercer, who had built this cabin, who had stayed on this mountain for 67 years after the night everything broke, who had died 3 years ago at the age of 102, 4 miles north of the clearing where Ruth was now sitting in the dark. She sat with this for a long time. Outside, the mountain had gone fully dark, and the only sound was the creak and the wind and the occasional settling of the cabin around her. She had set up her camp lantern before the light failed, and it cast a warm circle across the kitchen table and the flattened pages in her hands resting on the edge of the table. She thought about 40 years of walking in the wilderness, about the way the land held things, seeds in frozen groundwater, in rock, the memory of old fires in the growth patterns of trees, about the way the wilderness gave nothing away cheaply, but gave everything eventually to the person who was patient enough and attentive enough and willing to come back enough times. She had come back. She had not known she was coming back. She had thought she was buying an $11,000 problem on a mountain she had never visited. But the photograph in the armchair and the journal behind the baseboard and the pages inside the stovepipe had been here the whole time, held by the mountain, the way the mountain held everything patiently, without judgment, waiting for the person they belonged to. Ruth folded the hidden pages carefully and placed them back in the journal. She put the journal in her backpack, in the padded sleeve she used for maps that could not be replaced. She picked up the photograph from where she had set it on the table and looked at it one more time in the lantern light. Her mother, 24 years old, standing on this porch with the silver brooch in her hair and the particular expression of someone who knows exactly where she is. First summer on the ridge. Ruth put the photograph in the breast pocket of her shirt where she could feel it against her chest. Tomorrow she would go to Waynesboro. She would find the newspaper archive and she would find out what had been reported about the night of November 28, 1954, and she would find out what had happened to Owen Mercer after the agents had taken him and her mother had run south through the dark, carrying the beginning of Ruth's life inside her. She would find the threads, and she would follow them the way she had followed trails for 40 years, with patience and attention and the quiet certainty that the wilderness always told the truth to the person who was willing to listen. But tonight she would stay here. She made herself a meal on the camp stove she had brought in her truck, soup from a can and crackers and the last of the coffee from her thermos. She ate at the kitchen table with the lantern burning and her mother's journal in its padded sleeve and the sound of the creek running somewhere below in the dark. When she finished, she washed her cup at the hand pump sink, working the stiff handle until cold mountain water ran brown with rust and then ran clear. And she thought that was something worth knowing about this place, that beneath all the years of abandonment, the water still ran clean. She unrolled her sleeping bag in the main room near the fireplace. She had found a tarp of dry firewood under the eave on the north side. Someone's last practical act before leaving this place forever, and she built a small fire that took on the first match and burned with the steady confidence of wood that had been sheltered from weather. She lay in the warmth and listened to the cabin settle around her. It was not an unfamiliar sound to her, the nighttime language of old structures, the tick and creak of wood, responding to temperature change, the small percussive complaints of joints and joists, and the slow conversation between a building and its foundation. She had spent hundreds of nights in backcountry shelters and fire lookout stations, had learned to distinguish the sounds that were simply age from the sounds that meant something needed attention. This cabin sounded like age. It sounded like a place that had been standing for a long time and intended to keep standing. She fell asleep to the fire and the creek and the wind, and in the small room down the hall, the rocking chair with the broken runner sat by the window in the dark, and outside the Blue Ridge Mountains held the night, the way they had always held things, without effort, without judgment, keeping faith with whatever had been left in their care. She woke before dawn to a cabin that had gone cold. The fire had burned down to ash and orange coals while she slept, and the mountain air had moved back in through every gap and crack, with the patient thoroughness of something that had been waiting just outside. Ruth lay in her sleeping bag and watched her breath make small clouds in the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the dirty windows. She got up, rebuilt the fire from the dry wood under the eave, and made coffee on her camp stove while the cabin warmed. She stood at the kitchen window with her cup and watched the clearing come back from darkness, the tree line resolving out of black into individual shapes, the sky going from gray to the particular pale gold that comes just before the sun clears the ridge. A doe stepped into the clearing edge, stood motionless for 30 seconds with her ears moving like small radar dishes, then stepped back into the trees. Ruth drank her coffee and thought about what she knew and what she needed to find. She knew her mother had lived in this cabin in 1951 through 1954. She knew her mother had loved a man named Owen Mercer, and that Owen Mercer had built this cabin with his own hands. She knew she had been conceived here, that her mother had fled in November 1954 while pregnant, and that she herself had been born in Oregon 14 months later. She knew something terrible had happened on the night of November 28, 1954, and something that had scattered 7 families and left one man alone on a mountain for 67 years. What she didn't know was the shape of the official record, the names and dates that had been written down, the version that existed in public archives, and how far it differed from what her mother had witnessed and hidden. She also needed the map. She had noticed it the night before, but had not examined it carefully, too focused on the journal and the hidden pages. It was tucked into the back cover of the journal, folded twice, drawn in pencil on the back of an envelope. She unfolded it now at the kitchen table in the growing morning light. It was a topographic sketch, crude but accurate in the way that sketches made by people who know terrain are accurate, not precise in measurement, but true in relationship. The way a good tracker draws a trail, not from a surveyor's distance, but from having walked it. She could identify the clearing where she was sitting, marked with a small square. The creek to the south was drawn as a wavy line. The ridge above was indicated by hash marks. And scattered across the terrain within a 4-mile radius were 5 marks, each a different symbol. A circle, a triangle, 2 X's, and one location northeast of her position by perhaps 2 miles, marked with a circle that had been traced over so many times the pencil had nearly worn through the paper. Ruth looked at the topographic map she had brought in her truck, spread it on the table beside the hand-drawn sketch, and spent 20 minutes cross-referencing landmarks until she understood where each symbol sat in real terrain. The heavily circled location was at a rocky outcrop she could identify on the topographic map, a granite formation at roughly 2,800 feet, accessible by a trail that had probably once been maintained and was now almost certainly overgrown. 2 miles northeast, 800 feet of elevation gain. She would go there after Waynesboro. First the record, then the land. The drive down the mountain took 40 minutes on roads that improved as she descended the switchbacks, giving way to graded gravel and then to asphalt and then to the 2-lane state road that ran the valley floor toward town. She passed farms and a volunteer fire station and a church with a hand-lettered sign offering comfort in language that had not changed in 100 years. The valley was beautiful in the way that settled places are beautiful, not wild but tended. The land shaped by generations of people who had learned it slowly and stayed. Waynesboro was small, a town that had once been more than it currently was, the downtown, holding the bones of its earlier ambitions in the form of buildings slightly too grand for their current occupants. The library was on a side street 2 blocks from the main intersection, a single-story brick building with a parking lot that held 3 cars on a Wednesday morning. Inside it was cool and smelled of old paper and the particular cleaning product that every small-town library Ruth had ever entered seemed to use exclusively. A woman in her 60s sat behind the reference desk, working a computer keyboard with the focused deliberateness of someone who had made peace with technology without ever becoming comfortable with it. She looked up when Ruth came in. "Help you find something?" "Newspaper archive," Ruth said. "Local papers from 1954 and 1955. Anything you have?" The woman, her name Tag, read. Constance studied Ruth for a moment with the calibrated curiosity of a person who has worked reference for many years and has learned to read the difference between genealogy tourists and people who are looking for something specific and personal. "We have the Valley Courier on microfiche going back to 1921, she said, "and the Richmond paper on database from 1950. The federal records from that period are mostly digitized now, too, if you know what you're looking for. I'm looking for an incident, Ruth said. A shooting, a collective community up on the ridge. Late 1954, maybe reported in early 1955. Constance was quiet for a moment. Then she said the ridge folk. Ruth waited. My grandmother talked about them, Constance said. Not with much sympathy, I'm afraid, but she talked about them. Come on back. The microfiche reader was a machine from approximately 1985 that worked well enough once Ruth remembered that you adjusted the focus with the left knob and the lateral position with the right. Constance showed her the filing system and left her to it, and Ruth spent the next hour moving through the Valley Courier from October 1954 through March 1955, reading the news of a small Virginia county during the coldest years of the Cold War. She found the article on the front page of the December 3rd, 1954 edition. The headline read, Federal agents involved in fatal shooting at Ridge Community, 1 dead, several detained. The article was 4 paragraphs. It described how agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation conducting a lawful investigation into reported subversive activities had visited a communal property on Harlan Ridge and encountered armed resistance. A resident named Dale Pruitt, 41, had been shot and killed after advancing on federal officers with a rifle. Several other residents had been taken into custody for questioning. The investigation was ongoing. The name Owen Mercer did not appear in the article. Ruth searched forward through December and into the new year. She found a follow-up piece in mid-January 1955, 3 paragraphs buried on page 7, noting that all individuals detained in connection with the Harlan Ridge incident had been released without charges and that the property had been vacated. A brief editorial in February expressed relief that the investigation had concluded without further incident and used the word un-American twice in 4 sentences. That was the entire public record. Ruth sat back from the reader and thought about what she was not seeing. No names of the detained except by implication. No mention of Warren Fossey. No mention of what authority the agents had actually been operating under or what the investigation had been predicated on. The official record was not a lie exactly. It was a frame built carefully around a selective collection of true things designed to show a shape that was not the actual shape of what had happened. She printed what she had found and went back to the reference desk. Is there anything else? Constance asked. I'm looking for a man named Owen Mercer, Ruth said. He would have been in his mid-30s in 1954. Carpenter. Lived on Harlan Ridge most of his life, died around 2021. Constance typed for a moment. Death records would be through the county clerk, she said, but I can check the local digitized records. She typed for a moment longer, then said, there's a property tax record under that name going back to 1957. A parcel on the north end of the ridge, about 40 acres. That's him. And there's an obituary. Constance turned the monitor so Ruth could see. From the Waynesboro News Virginian, 2021. The obituary was 4 sentences. Owen Mercer, 102, of Harlan Ridge, passed away at home on March 14, 2021. He was a carpenter by trade and a longtime resident of Augusta County. He was preceded in death by his parents. No survivors are listed. Services were private. 4 sentences for 102 years. Ruth stood at the counter for a moment, looking at the 4 sentences, and felt something move through her that was not grief exactly. Grief requires a prior relationship, and she had not known this man existed until yesterday, but was adjacent to grief, the recognition of an absence that had always been there without her knowing it had a name. She thanked Constance and walked out into the morning. She was standing in the parking lot, keys in her hand, deciding whether to drive back up the mountain or sit with this for a moment longer when a voice came from behind her. You were asking about the ridge folk, She turned. A man sat on the low brick wall at the edge of the parking lot, the posture of someone who had been sitting there for a while and was not surprised to see her. He was 79, maybe 80, with the angular, weathered face of a man who had spent significant time outdoors in his earlier years and now wore that history in deep lines and the permanently squinted quality of eyes that had looked into too much glare. He wore a gray canvas jacket and a ball cap with no insignia, and he held a paper coffee cup in both hands.
"I'm Prescott Lyle,"
he said. "I come here Wednesdays. Constance sometimes texts me when someone's looking into what happened up on that ridge." He paused. "My father was one of the agents." Ruth sat down on the wall beside him. They talked for a long time. Prescott Lyle had been 9 years old in 1954, old enough to know that something had changed in his father after that winter, not old enough to understand what it was until much later. His father, a 20-year FBI veteran named Donald Lyle, had carried the Harlan Ridge incident for the rest of his life, with the particular quality of a man who has done something he cannot justify and cannot undo. "He told me the truth when I was in my 40s, Prescott said. Said he'd been carrying it long enough and wanted someone else to know before he died. What he told me was not what was in the papers." Ruth said, "I know. I found my mother's account." Prescott looked at her steadily. "Your mother was there, Ada Brennan. She was Owen Mercer's partner. She was pregnant when she ran. I was born 14 months later in Oregon." Prescott was quiet for a long moment. "Then you're their daughter?" "Yes." He looked at his coffee cup. "My father said Owen Mercer was the most decent man he ever put in handcuffs. Said it more than once." He paused. "They held him for 12 days. No charges, no formal processing, just held him in a county facility while they made sure the story had settled. When they let him go, my father drove him back to the ridge himself. Said Owen didn't speak the entire drive, just sat in the passenger seat looking out the window at the mountains." "Did your father ever go back?" "Once, in 1978. He'd retired by then, and he went up to that cabin Owen was living in and knocked on the door. Owen answered. My father apologized. Said he was sorry for what they'd done to the community, sorry for how it had ended." Prescott stopped. Owen told him the apology was accepted, but that it didn't change anything. Then he offered my father a cup of coffee, and they sat on the porch for an hour without talking much, and my father drove home. He looked at Ruth. "Dad said it was the most civilized thing that had ever happened to him. Said Owen Mercer had a quality he'd never seen in anyone else. Said he just endured, like the mountain itself." Ruth drove back up to the cabin with the printed articles on the passenger seat and Prescott Lyle's phone number in her notebook and a knowledge of her father that had grown from nothing to something substantial in the space of a morning. Owen Mercer had been organized, principled, skilled with his hands and his words, capable of accepting an apology without letting it cost him more than it was worth. He had been arrested and held and released and had returned to the mountain and had sat on his porch and endured. She ate a quick lunch at the cabin and packed her day pack for the hike northeast. The trail was exactly where the topographic map said it would be, beginning at the far edge of the clearing behind the cabin and climbing immediately into second growth timber that gave way to older forest as the elevation increased. The trail itself had not been maintained in decades, but it had been cut deliberately, and the cut was still visible to a trained eye, the slight depression in the leaf litter, the way the undergrowth was marginally thinner along a specific line. The occasional blaze mark on a tree faded to near invisibility, but present if you were looking. Ruth was looking. She climbed steadily, her breathing finding its rhythm, her bad knee sending its familiar commentary up through her hip. But nothing she could not manage. The forest was rich and dense, the canopy filtering the afternoon light into long green columns, and the sound of the lower creek faded behind her, as a higher creek, smaller and colder, began to make itself heard ahead. She crossed it on a fallen log, tested the log first with her full weight, found it solid. The rock formation appeared at the 2-mile mark, a jumble of granite boulders that looked as if they had rolled from the ridge above and stopped only from mutual support, the largest ones the size of small houses, the spaces between them creating a maze of narrow passages and sheltered alcoves. Lichen covered everything in shades of gray and green and the particular orange that comes with decades of exposure. Ruth circled the formation once before committing to anything, reading it the way she had been trained to read terrain. She was looking for the place she would choose if she were hiding something she needed to keep dry and undisturbed and accessible only to someone who was specifically looking. She found it on the northwest face between 2 boulders that leaned together at the top to form an inverted V, the gap between them at ground level protected from rain and direct sun by the overhang above. She had to crouch to see into the space properly and then get on her knees in the leaf litter to reach into it. The metal box was exactly where the hand-drawn map had promised. It was perhaps 14 inches long and 8 wide, olive green paint, gone to rust in patches, the kind of box that had once held ammunition or tools. The latch was stiff but not locked, and Ruth worked it carefully until it gave with a grinding complaint. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had partially degraded over the decades, was a bundle of envelopes tied with twine that had gone brown and brittle but had held 32 letters, each one addressed in the same hand, Owen Mercer's hand. Ruth understood, though she had never seen it before, to Ada Brennan and later to Ada Kaner at addresses that shifted across the years from Oregon to Idaho to back to Oregon. The earliest was dated June 1951. The latest was dated September 1957. Ruth sat on the cold ground between the granite boulders with the letters in her lap, and the afternoon sun coming through the tree canopy in slow-moving patches, and she read. Owen Mercer had been a man who wrote the way he apparently built things carefully with attention to weight and proportion, each sentence placed where it would carry load. He was not flowery or sentimental in his language, but the feeling came through the plainness, the way grain comes through bare wood, the structure of the thing itself made visible. He wrote about the community in the early letters, the progress of the buildings, the first full harvest, the arguments about whether to put in a root cellar before the second winter or wait until spring. He wrote about Ada with the restraint of a man who is writing letters that might be read by others, but the restraint itself was expressive, the way certain silences in music carry more than the notes around them. The middle letters from 1953 and into 1954 showed the pressure increasing. He wrote about the federal visits with a controlled anger that never became panic. The anger of a principled man who understands that the principle is being violated but has not yet stopped believing that the violation can be addressed through legitimate means. He wrote about Dale Pruitt with genuine concern, the way a person writes about someone they care for, who is making decisions they cannot support. And in the letter from September 1954, 2 months before everything ended, he wrote, "The baby will be here in the spring. Ada tells me late January or February, though she says the mountains will argue with any date we choose. I have been thinking about what I want to build for the room. Not just what furniture, though I know what I'll make. What I've been thinking about is what I want her to feel when she's in it. I want her to feel like the walls are on her side." Ruth read that sentence 3 times. The final letters written after November 1954, after the night and the arrest, and whatever had happened in the 12 days they held him, were different in quality, not broken. Owen Mercer did not write like a man who was broken, but altered. The way a bone is altered by a healed fracture, still whole, still load-bearing, but changed in its internal structure. He wrote about looking for Ada, about the letters returned unopened, about going to Oregon and finding that she had moved without leaving a forwarding address, and about understanding what that meant without writing the understanding plainly. The way you acknowledge a thing in the space between sentences rather than in the sentences themselves. The final letter, September 1957, was 3 paragraphs. The first said that he had stopped trying to find her, and that he understood why she had gone, and that he did not blame her. The second said that he was staying on the ridge because it was his home, and because leaving would mean admitting that the thing they had tried to build had been entirely destroyed, and he did not believe that yet. The third paragraph was a single sentence. If she is ever old enough to find this, tell her that her father thought of her every day. Ruth sat with the letter for a long time. The afternoon had moved while she read the light going from direct to oblique, the shadows of the boulders stretching out across the ground. A raven called somewhere above the tree line, the sound carrying down the slope with the clear carrying quality of high-altitude air. She put the letters carefully back in the box and secured the latch. She would come back for them with better carrying materials. They had stayed safe here for 67 years. They would be safe for 2 more days. She hiked back down in the evening light. Harlan Duff was sitting in his truck at the edge of the clearing when she came out of the tree's engine off, drinking coffee from a thermos. He rolled down his window when she approached. "Thought I'd check," he said. "Didn't want to intrude." "You're not intruding." Ruth leaned against the truck door. "Can you show me his cabin?" Harlan looked at her for a moment. "Owen's place, yes. Tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning." She spent that evening at the kitchen table with the journal and the hidden pages in a notebook she had bought at a gas station on the way back from Waynesboro, writing down everything she knew in the order she had come to know it, dates and names and the chain of events as she had assembled it from multiple sources. She was building a map, not of terrain, but of what had happened, which required the same discipline as navigation, attention to what was verifiably present, restraint about what was inferred, honesty about where the gaps were. The gaps were still significant. She did not know what had become of Warren Fossey, the man who had actually fired the shot that killed Dale Pruitt. She did not know the names and current locations of most of the other collective families. She did not know the full scope of what Owen's 67 years alone on this mountain had looked like from the inside. She was building toward those answers, but first she needed to see where he had lived. They drove up the North Fire Road at 8 the next morning, Harlan's truck in front, Ruth following. The road deteriorated past the point where it appeared on any map she had, becoming a track maintained only by occasional use. And after 2 miles, Harlan stopped and they walked the remaining half-mile on foot through timber that had not been significantly disturbed in decades. Owen Mercer's cabin sat in a clearing smaller than the one around Ruth's cabin, sheltered on 3 sides by ridge and on the 4th by a stand of old white oaks that had been there by Ruth's estimation since before the Revolution. The cabin was single-story, 1 main room and a back addition. And where Ruth's cabin had been abandoning itself to the mountain, this one had been maintained. Not elaborately, the siding needed paint. The porch boards wanted replacing. The chimney had lost mortar from the top courses, but maintained with the determined minimalism of a person working alone with limited resources and unlimited determination. Someone had cared about this building until they could no longer care for it. The door was locked with a padlock that had rusted shut. Harlan had a bolt cutter in his truck. He went back for it, and Ruth stood on the porch and looked out at the clearing and the oaks, and thought about a man standing in this same spot in the early morning for 67 years. The padlock gave with a single cut. The door opened inward. Ruth stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, a habit from her years in the backcountry. Read the space before you enter it. What she read was a room that had been lived in with great intention and very little. A bed against the far wall, the blankets folded with military precision. A wood stove in the corner with a split log and a piece of fat wood in the firebox, as if Owen had laid the next fire before he understood there would not be one. A table, one chair. Bookshelves built into the east wall, floor to ceiling, holding perhaps 300 volumes arranged with evident care. And on the wall directly opposite the door, the wall that would be the first thing you saw every time you walked into this cabin from outside photographs. Ruth stepped inside and stood before them. They covered the entire wall in neat rows pinned with small tacks at the corners, dozens of them, black and white and faded color, varying in size from small snapshots to enlargements. Ada was in many of them. Ada Young laughing at something off camera, her hand raised to block the sun. Ada standing in a garden with her fists on her hips, surveying the planted rows with the particular satisfaction of someone who has made something grow. Ada and Owen together, his arm around her waist, and both of them facing the camera with the slightly self-conscious expression of people who do not photograph themselves often. The collective families were there too. Children running through a meadow, adults gathered around a long table, a framing crew raising a wall section with everyone's arms extended overhead in the universal human posture of collective effort. And in the center of the wall, larger than the others, positioned at exactly eye level as if placed there to be the first thing and the last thing seen, a photograph of Ada visibly pregnant standing in the main room of Ruth's cabin, with both hands resting on her rounded belly. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that Ruth had to look at for a long time before she could name it. It was not happiness exactly, though happiness was part of it. It was the expression of a person who is simultaneously completely present and aware that the present moment is going to end. Written on the border at the bottom, in the careful pencil script Ruth now recognized as Owen's hand, Ada, November 1954, our last photograph together. Harlan stood in the doorway behind her without speaking. Ruth was grateful for his silence. She stood before the wall of photographs for a long time, moving her eyes from image to image, assembling her father from the evidence he had left of himself. The capable hands, the steady posture, the quality of attention in his face when he looked at something he loved. He had loved Ada. That was plain in every image of them together, and he had kept the evidence of that love on his wall for 67 years, which was a kind of faithfulness Ruth had never encountered before and did not have an adequate word for. She went to the table and looked at the drawer. Inside were the letters. She had expected them, had known from her mother's journal that Owen had written, and that the letters had been returned, but seeing them was different from knowing about them. There were perhaps 40 envelopes in the drawer, bundled in groups by rubber bands gone brittle with age, each one addressed to Ada, each one stamped return to sender in red ink or marked address unknown in the cramped hand of a postal worker who had processed the rejection without ceremony. He had written for years. He had written past the point where the letters were coming back, past the point where any reasonable person would have understood that the correspondence was not wanted. He had written because not writing was a form of abandonment he was not willing to commit. Ruth picked up one of the returned envelopes and held it for a moment, this object that had traveled from a Virginia mountain to an Oregon address and back again, carrying words her mother had never read. Beneath the bundled letters at the bottom of the drawer was a small velvet box. Dark red, the velvet worn smooth at the corners from handling. Ruth opened it. Inside was a silver brooch, identical to the one in the photograph, identical to the one Ruth had in the green velvet box in her dresser in Staunton, which she had inherited from her mother without knowing its story. 5 petals, round center, a small bent petal on the lower left where it had been repaired. The same small imperfection. Ruth looked at it for a long moment, understanding that Owen had made 2 of them, one for Ada, which Ada had kept and worn hidden all her life, and one for the daughter who had never come. Beneath the brooch, a folded slip of paper. The handwriting was recognizable as Owen's, but smaller the letters, more compressed, the hand of someone very old. Ruth unfolded it. "For my daughter, for when she finds her way back." She stood very still for a moment in the cabin her father had lived in alone for 67 years. Then she went to look at the rest of the room. The books on the shelves were well read, their spines cracked and their pages marked a lifetime of reading in a place with no television and apparently no great need for one. Carpentry manuals, natural history, 3 shelves of American history with heavy annotation in the margins, poetry more than she would have expected, a Bible with a broken spine that fell open to the Psalms. On the top shelf, too high to read the spines without standing on something, was a row of journals. Ruth counted 9 of them, the same hand-bound leather format as her mother's journal, all of them clearly made by the same hands. Owen had made his own journals. He had made them and filled them across the decades, 9 volumes covering 67 years. And Ruth stood below them on the floor of his cabin and understood that she was looking at the full account of a life that she had not known existed until 3 days ago. She was not ready to read them today. She needed to know one more thing first. There was a door at the back of the main room leading to the addition she had noticed from outside. Ruth went to it. The door was unlocked, but stiff, the frame swollen from years of temperature change, and she had to pull it hard to get it open. Inside was a small room, perhaps 10 feet by 12, and the first thing she registered was that it was different in quality from the rest of the cabin. Not different in construction, the same careful workmanship, but different in purpose, and the purpose was visible in every detail. A child's bed against one wall, sized for a child of perhaps 6 or 7, built from the same white oak as the bookshelves in the main room. The headboard carved with the same apple blossom pattern as the window frame of the other cabin. A small dresser, 4 drawers painted cream with hand-painted blue flowers on each drawer front. On the dresser, a row of carved wooden animals, 6 of them each one, perhaps 4 inches tall. A deer, a bear, a fox, a rabbit, an owl, a mountain lion. Each one articulated and detailed and made with a skill that was beyond mere craft, the work of someone who had needed the making of them. Ruth picked up the fox. It fit perfectly in her palm, the weight and balance of it exactly right, the fur texture suggested by fine parallel cuts in the wood. She had known carpenters in her life, and she knew the difference between work and extraordinary work. And this was extraordinary, the work of a man who had put something beyond skill into these objects, something that had nowhere else to go. On the wall, images of the forest, the ridge, the clearing printed large and framed simply, and centered above the bed, given the placement of something sacred, was a photograph. Ada, visibly pregnant, sitting in the rocking chair in the small bedroom of Ruth's cabin, looking out the window at the clearing. She did not know she was being photographed. Owen had caught her in an unguarded moment, her hands resting open in her lap, her face turned toward the light. On the small writing desk in the corner, a leather-bound book. Ruth opened it. It was not a journal. It was an album filled with photographs accumulated over decades. Photographs of a girl and then a young woman growing up, taken from distances that suggested the photographer had not been present as a known figure, but as an observer. Ruth as a girl, perhaps 9 or 10, on what appeared to be a school playground, caught in the background of the frame. Ruth at what must have been her Forest Service graduation, the image taken from the parking lot edge. Her face recognizable but distant. Ruth in her wedding dress, photographed through a church fence from across the street, blurred slightly from the distance but unmistakable. He had come. Across the decades, on specific occasions, he had somehow known about he had come and had stood at the margin of her life and looked at her and had not spoken. Ruth sat down The mattress was covered with a quilt hand-stitched in a pattern she recognized from books about American textile history, a variation of the bear's paw, a traditional Appalachian pattern. The colors faded, but the stitching still tight and even. Someone had made this quilt and put it on this bed, and the quilt had been here since, waiting under a thin layer of dust for the occupant who had never come. He had built this room. He had built it and furnished it and stocked it with carved animals and a quilt and a framed photograph, and then he had kept it waiting for 67 years, maintaining the cabin but not touching this room, letting it remain exactly as he had made it in the years after Ada ran, as if changing it would mean accepting that she was not coming back, that the daughter was not coming, that the life he had built this room for was not going to arrive. Ruth looked at the carved animals on the dresser, 6 of them precisely made. She thought about a man who was 100 years old, sitting in his cabin 4 miles north of the place where Ada had carried their unborn child through the last days before everything fell apart, carving a fox from a piece of white oak with hands that had been making things for 8 decades. She thought about what you carve when you are 100 years old. And there is no one to carve for. You carve anyway. Because the making is itself a form of presence, a way of remaining in relation to something even when the thing itself is absent. Because the hands that built this cabin and laid that fireplace and made those journals were hands that did not know how to stop building, even when what they were building toward was a possibility that grew smaller with every passing year. Harlan appeared in the doorway behind her. He stood there for a moment, taking in the room, and Ruth saw on his face the expression of a man who has been neighbor to a solitude for 30 years without fully understanding its dimensions until this moment. He never said anything about this, Harlan said quietly. No, Ruth said, he wouldn't have. She stood up, still holding the fox, and looked around the room one last time. The bed, the dresser, the animals, the quilt, the photograph above the bed, the writing desk with the album of a daughter's life watched from a distance. Outside, a wind moved through the white oaks, the sound traveling down through the canopy and in through the doorway, a sound like the mountain itself exhaling slowly, the long breath of something very old and very patient that has been holding itself in a particular shape for a very long time and is only now, only at this moment, able to release it. Ruth closed her hand around the carved fox. She carried it out of the cabin with her into the afternoon, into the clearing under the white oaks where the wind was moving the high branches in long, slow arcs, and the light came through in shifting patterns across the ground. She stood there with it in her closed hand and let herself be here fully in this moment that had taken 68 years to arrive. She had come from this mountain. This mountain had been waiting for her. Everything else, every truth and grief and revelation still ahead of her, would proceed from that understanding, from the ground of it, from the solid and unhurried foundation of a woman who had finally found the place that was built for her. She brought the carved fox home. That was how she thought of it on the drive back from Owen's cabin, not back to the property, not back to the ruin she had purchased 8 days ago for $13,500. Home. The word arrived without announcement and settled into her thinking with the ease of something that had always belonged there and had simply been waiting for her to use it correctly. She set the fox on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light would find it. Then she made coffee and sat at the table with her notebook and began to write down everything she still needed to know. It was a habit from her decades in the back country. Before you move, you account for what you have and what you lack. You do not proceed on assumption. You proceed on inventory. What she had: the journal, the hidden pages, the letters from the metal box, the photograph, the returned envelopes, the velvet box with the silver brooch, the album from Owen's cabin, the 9 journals on his shelf that she had not yet read, and the account from Prescott Lyle. What she lacked: the fate of Warren Foss, the man who had actually fired the shot. the whereabouts of the other collective families. The full interior account of Owen's 67 years, which the journals would provide, but which she was not ready to absorb in a single sitting. And one thing that had been nagging at her since the night she found the hidden pages her mother had concealed. Those pages deliberately had considered them dangerous, even decades after the events they described. Which meant Warren Fosse or his family might still have reason to be sensitive about the truth of what had happened. She needed to proceed carefully with that particular thread. The other threads she could pull more freely. She spent 3 days reading Owen's journals. She read them at the kitchen table and in the rocking chair by the window of the smallest bedroom. She read with her notebook open beside her and a pencil in her hand, noting names and dates, and the details that would let her cross-reference with what she already knew. But increasingly she set the pencil down and simply read, because what Owen Mercer had written across 67 years of solitary life on a Virginia mountain was not primarily a document of events. It was a document of attention. He wrote about the mountain, the way a man writes about the thing he loves best and cannot leave, which was, Ruth understood exactly what it was. He wrote about the forest in its seasonal changes, the particular quality of each month's light, the animal populations he had tracked across decades, the slow changes in the watershed that told him things about climate that no government report had yet confirmed. He wrote about his work, the cabins he built for people in the valley, the furniture commissions, the repairs that took him away from the ridge for days at a time and always brought him back with the relief of someone returning to the only place that made sense. He wrote about the books he read and what he thought about them. He wrote about the collective in the early journals with a grief that was precise and unsentimental, the grief of a man who does not permit himself self-pity, but does permit himself honesty. He wrote about Ada, not obsessively, not with the quality of a man who has been destroyed by loss and rebuilt himself around the destruction, but regularly, the way you write about the weather or the season as a fact of the landscape of your life present, whether or not you speak of it. He wrote about thinking of her on specific days, on her birthday, which he had apparently memorized, on the anniversaries of particular moments he had not forgotten. He wrote about the returned letters without bitterness, with the same quality of acceptance he brought to everything, not resignation, which is giving up, but acceptance, which is understanding the shape of what is and continuing to live within it with intention. He wrote about Ruth. The first mention was in a journal from 1957 when Ruth would have been 1 year old. He wrote that he had been thinking about her since he learned Ada was pregnant, had continued thinking about her after the night. Everything ended and intended to go on thinking about her because she was his daughter, and that was not a thing that changed because of circumstances. He did not know where she was. He did not know what she looked like. He wrote these facts with the plainness of a man writing down the weather, not good weather or bad weather, just what it was. In a journal from 1971, a single paragraph. I drove to Staunton today. I found the address through a property record. Ada is listed on a lease on Madison Street. I parked across from the school at 3 o'clock. I saw her come out with the other children. She is 15. She has Ada's walk, that particular way of moving that suggests the ground is worth paying attention to, and something else, something in the set of her shoulders that I recognized without being able to say from where. She laughed at something a friend said, and the laugh carried across the street. I sat in the truck for 20 minutes after the children were gone. Then I drove back to the ridge. It would have been wrong to speak to her. She has a life I am not part of. I will not make myself part of it by force. Ruth read this paragraph 4 times. He had seen her. He had driven to Staunton when she was 15 years old and had sat across from her school and had watched her come out with her friends and had heard her laugh and had driven back to the mountain alone because he had decided that the life she had was more important than the thing he needed. She sat with the weight of that for a long time. It was She thought one of the most difficult things a person could do to have what you have longed for within reach, and to choose not to take it, not from indifference, but from the specific disciplined love that puts another person's wholeness above your own need. Owen Mercer had not been absent from her life because he didn't care. He had been absent because he cared too much to arrive uninvited into a life that had been built, however imperfectly, without him. On the fourth day, she found the letter. She had been putting off the final structural check of the cabin, the areas she had assessed for damage but not yet searched, with the careful attention she had given to the interior rooms. The porch was one of them. She had noted on her first day that 2 boards needed immediate replacement, and on the 4th morning she got her pry bar from the truck and started at the northeast corner. The 3rd board she tested was wrong. Not structurally wrong, it was sound enough, no wrought good nail purchase. But the nail pattern was wrong. The surrounding boards had been face-nailed with the consistency of machine work, the nails in identical pairs at regular intervals. This board had been face-nailed with the same pattern, but the nails were slightly different, slightly larger, slightly more recent. The oxidation pattern telling her they had been set perhaps 30 or 40 years after the surrounding hardware. Someone had lifted this board and replaced it carefully. Someone who was trying to match the original appearance closely enough that a casual observer would not notice. Ruth worked the board up with the flat of the pry bar, not forcing it, easing the nails out of the joist one at a time. The board came free. In the space between the porch joists, protected from moisture by the boards above and the concrete foundation below, was a metal tin, the kind that had once held tobacco. The lid fitted tight against the body. The whole thing wrapped in a double layer of plastic sheeting sealed with electrical tape. Ruth carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table. She cut the tape with her knife and unwrapped the plastic. The tin was dry inside. She opened it. A letter folded 3 times in a legal-sized envelope. The envelope was addressed in her mother's handwriting for Ruth when she finds this place. Ruth stood at the table for a full minute without touching the envelope. Outside the window, the morning was clear and cool, the clearing bright with late summer light, and the fox sat on the windowsill, and the coffee was going cold in her cup, and the letter was on the table with her name on it in her mother's hand. She sat down and opened it. "My darling Ruth," it began, "if you are reading this, then you found your way back to Harlan Ridge. I always thought you might. You were always the kind of person who followed things to their source, even when the source was difficult. Even when I tried to make the source invisible. I need to explain, though. I know that explanation is not the same as justification. I have lived with that distinction for 68 years, and I will die with it, and I am sorry for that, sorry for what I did, and sorry that I lacked the courage to undo it while I was still alive. In November 1954, when I was 4 months pregnant with you, and the world I had built for us had come apart in a single terrible night, I was 26 years old, and I was afraid. Not afraid in the general way that people use that word. Afraid with specificity and reason, afraid of men who had demonstrated they were willing to use the instruments of the state against ordinary people who had done nothing more threatening than choose to live differently. They had killed Dale Pruitt, and they had arrested Owen, and they had made clear that the investigation was not over, and that the children in the community were not beyond their reach. So I ran. I took everything I could carry, and I ran south through the dark, and I will not pretend that I made a considered, rational decision, because I did not. I acted from terror the way animals act, and I was not wrong to do so, but I was wrong in what came after. I was wrong to stay gone. I was wrong to stop answering Owen's letters. I was wrong to marry George Kaner without telling you the truth about where you came from. I was wrong to let the years accumulate until the weight of the lie was so great that uncovering it felt like it would bury us both. George knew you were not his. He knew I was carrying something I was not going to tell him about, and he accepted that. He was a good man, Ruth. I want you to know that clearly and without qualification. He chose you. He showed up for your life every day for 30 years, and he loved you as completely as a man can love a child who isn't biologically his. That choice is not diminished by the truth about Owen.
They are both true. At the same time, Owen is your father, and George was your father, and both of those things matter. Owen tried to find us.
I know he did because his letters came for years forwarded through 3 different addresses before the trail went cold. I never opened them. I was afraid that opening them would cost me the life I had built, and by the time I was secure enough to risk it, too much time had passed. The lie had become the architecture of our daily life, and I did not know how to dismantle it without bringing the walls down.
I bought the cabin back in 1988. It had been sitting in county foreclosure for years, and when I saw the listing, I drove from Staunton to look at it, and I stood in the clearing and I understood that I owed you this place even if I could not give it to you directly. I bought it under my maiden name. I paid the taxes every year. I arranged with an attorney in Waynesboro, a man named Frederick Oates. If he is still practicing to contact you after I was gone, and provide you with the deed and the instructions for finding what I had left here. Something went wrong. Either Frederick Oates retired or died, or the paperwork was lost in the way that paperwork is lost when the person responsible for it is no longer there to insist on its importance. I cannot know from where I am now what happened, but if you are reading this, it means the plan failed and you found your way here anyway, which means the mountain kept its end of the bargain even when the human arrangements fell apart. I want to tell you about Owen. Not the events. You will have found those by now if you have found this letter, because you are thorough and you are persistent and you have your father's way of following a thing to its source. I want to tell you what he was.
I was the most patient man I ever knew. Not passive. There is a difference between patience and passivity that most people do not understand, but Owen understood it in his bones. He was patient, the way a craftsman is patient
With purpose, waiting for the right moment to apply exactly the right force. He never raised his voice. He never stopped thinking. He had a quality that I have tried to describe to myself many times across 60 years of trying, and the closest I can come is this. He made the people around him feel that the ground was solid.
That was his gift. In a community of people who were all in one way or another afraid that the ground might give way, Owen was the person who made it feel solid.
I loved him with my whole self.
I want you to know that clearly, the same way I wanted you to know clearly that George was good and real and true, both things. Owen was the love of my life, and I left him on a mountain.
And it was the worst thing I ever did, and I will answer for it wherever people answer for the worst things they have done. Tell him, if he is still alive, that I never stopped. That every day I thought of the cabin and the clearing and the particular quality of the morning light on the ridge in June, and of the man who built that fireplace stone by stone because he believed a fireplace was the heart of a house. He was right about that. He was right about most things. I am sorry, my darling girl, for the lie and for the years and for the absence that had a name you didn't know.
You deserved the truth from the beginning. You deserved all of it, the cabin and the ridge and the father who thought about you every day. I hope the mountain is as beautiful as I remember it. All my love always, your mother, Ada.
Ruth read the letter twice.
Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope, and held the envelope in both hands the way you hold something you know you will carry for the rest of your life.
Her mother had bought this cabin back, had paid the taxes on it for 30 years under a name no one connected to her,
had set up a system to pass it to Ruth after her death, a system that had failed through the ordinary mortality of human arrangements, and had ended with Ruth buying her own inheritance at a county auction for $13,500 without knowing what she was buying.
The pull she had felt toward a single photograph in an online listing that had not been accident.
It had been the residue of her mother's intention, the tail end of a plan that had mostly failed, but had not entirely failed, the way water finds a path to lower ground, even when the original channel is blocked.
She went to Waynesboro that afternoon and found the office of Frederick Oates, attorney at law.
The receptionist informed her that Mr. Oates had retired in 2019 and that the firm had been acquired by a larger practice in Charlottesville. A phone call to the Charlottesville office confirmed that the files from Mr. Oates's estate practice had been archived but not fully digitized, and that a property held under the name Adeline Brennan had indeed been in the system.
With instructions for contact that had been noted as pending and then marked complete in error during the acquisition process, a clerical error. 30 years of her mother's careful planning collapsed by a single clerical error.
Ruth sat in the parking lot of the law office and felt something that was almost funny in the way that certain large and irrevocable
mistakes are almost funny when you have enough distance from them. Almost. Not quite. She drove back up the mountain. That evening she called the number Prescott Lyle had given her and asked if he knew anything about the remaining members of the collective, specifically about Warren Fossey or his family. Prescott said he would make some calls and get back to her. 2 days later, he called with the name Birch Pruitt of Greenville, Tennessee, Dale Pruitt's son, 77 years old. Prescott had gotten the number from his father's old contact notes, which he had kept in a box in his attic for 20 years against the possibility that they would someday be needed. Ruth looked at the number for a long time before she called it. She was aware of what she was doing, calling the son of the man whose death had started everything, carrying information about the true circumstances of that death that his family might or might not know, approaching a wound that had been closed for 67 years. She was aware that this could go badly. She called anyway because the truth did not become less true, because it was uncomfortable to carry, and because the people who had been harmed by the official false version of events deserved the actual version even this late. Birch Pruitt answered on the third ring with the cautious hello of a man who does not recognize the number. Ruth told him who she was and why she was calling. There was a long silence. "I know about what happened," Birch said finally. His voice was measured, carrying the quality of a man who had processed something difficult over a long period of time and had arrived at a position that was not peace exactly, but was stable. "My mother told me the truth when I was in my 30s. Warren Fossey came to see us in 1981. He'd been carrying it for 30 years and needed to say it out loud to someone. To my father's family." Ruth was quiet. "My father was not a good man," Birch said. "I spent a lot of years trying to figure out how to hold that he wasn't good and he didn't deserve to die, and both of those things were true at the same time. It took me a long time." He paused. Warren Fossey was protecting his family. He did what he did in a moment, and he spent the rest of his life answering for it internally. He died in 2003. I went to his funeral. "I'm sorry," Ruth said. "Don't be. I'm glad I went. It closed something." Another pause. "What I'm still angry about is the government's part, the cover-up. The way they used the situation to destroy something that was decent. Those people on that ridge weren't doing anything wrong. They were just living, and that was enough to make them a target." "Yes," Ruth said. "What are you going to do with what you know?" Ruth had been thinking about this. "Tell it accurately," she said. "All of it. The collective, the people who lived there, what actually happened and what was covered up. I'm going to put it in the record somewhere that doesn't disappear. And I'm going to finish restoring the cabin." Birch was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. The man who built that cabin, Owen Mercer, what kind of man was he?" Ruth looked at the fox on the windowsill.
She thought about the 9 journals and the wall of photographs and the room with the child's bed and the carved animals and the quilt, all of it maintained and waiting for 67 years. He was the kind of man who builds things to last, she said, and the kind who keeps faith long past the point where most people would have stopped. Birch was quiet for a moment. That's what I hoped, he said.
October arrived and brought the first cold nights, the kind that put a hard edge on the morning air and turned the ridge maples in 2 weeks, from green to the particular red that has no adequate name in English. Ruth had a plumber and an electrician up from Waynesboro to address the systems that were beyond her solo capability, and she worked alongside them when she could, learning how the cabin's bones responded to modern upgrades, asking questions, noting the places where Owen's original construction made the work easier than it had any right to be after 70 years. I had built the walls with 2x6 framing when 2x4 was standard, which gave her deeper insulation cavities and better structural depth. He had used copper for the original plumbing, which had oxidized to the beautiful blue-green of old coins, but was still fundamentally sound. The electrical system was hopeless and had to be replaced entirely, but the walls behind the original wiring revealed something that made the electrician stop and stare. Every junction was accessible. Every run was logical. The entire system laid out with the clarity of someone who had been thinking about the next person who would have to work inside these walls. Whoever built this, the electrician said, his head inside a wall cavity, was thinking about the future. Yes, Ruth said, he was. She did the interior work herself in the evenings after the tradesmen left, and on the weekend days when she was alone with the cabin and the ridge and the October light. She sanded the floors to the original wood, dense and close-grained, and finished them with oil rather than polyurethane because oil let the wood breathe. She replaced the broken window sashes with hand-fitted wood matching the original profiles. She repaired the rocking chair's runner with a piece of white oak. She milled herself from a fallen tree at the edge of the clearing. She restored the carved flowers on the window frame carefully with small chisels, refreshing the cuts where weather had softened them without changing the original pattern. Her mother had stood on this porch in 1952, 24 years old, with that pattern behind her shoulder and the silver brooch in her hair and her whole life in front of her. Ruth wanted the flowers there. She wanted every detail there. Above the fireplace, she hung the photograph. She had found it in Owen's collection. Ada and Owen on their wedding day standing on this porch, both of them in simple clothes, and both of them lit with the specific happiness of people who believe that the best is still ahead of them. The collective families were visible in the background, crowded and celebratory, someone's arm raised as if caught mid-gesture. Ruth had the photograph enlarged at a shop in Waynesboro and framed it in white oak from the same fallen tree as the rocking chair runner. She hung it at eye level over the fireplace, centered with the same care that Owen had centered his photographs on his own cabin wall. Her parents on the threshold of the life they had planned together. She stood back and looked at it for a long time. She thought about what it cost to tell the truth and what it cost not to. Her mother had paid the second cost, had paid it across 60 years of a life otherwise well lived, had paid it in the weight she carried and the things she could not say, and the love she had folded small and hidden in a velvet box in the back of a drawer. Owen had paid it differently, not in silence, but in solitude, in the particular expense of keeping faith within absence, of building and maintaining a space for a life that had not arrived. Ruth had not had the opportunity to pay either cost, because she had not known the truth long enough to have made choices about it. What she had now was the chance to do what neither of them had been able to do, to hold all of it at once, the love and the loss and the deception and the faithfulness, and to make something from it that was neither denial nor grief, but something more durable than either. November came, and the leaves came down all at once in a single week of wind and rain, and the ridge revealed its bones, the dark lines of the ridgeline against gray sky, the granite formations visible now through timber that had been hidden all summer. Ruth had the roof finished by the second week of November. A crew from Waynesboro working 3 days to strip and resheathe and reshingle, and the sound of rain on a sound roof that first night was one of the best things she had ever heard. She drove to the cemetery on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November. Owen was buried in the small county cemetery 8 miles down the valley road in a section at the back under 2 white oaks that looked as though they had been planted deliberately but were probably self-seeded. The mountain's habit of putting the right thing in the right place without being asked. The marker was simple, the minimum that the county required for an unmarked grave. A flat granite rectangle with his name, his dates, nothing else. Ruth had brought a new stone. She had ordered it from a monument maker in Staunton and driven it up in the bed of her truck wrapped in moving blankets. Harlan Duff had come with her and helped her set it, the two of them, leveling it into the ground with the methodical care of people who understand that the work matters even when no one is watching. The new stone read Owen Mercer, 1919 to 2021. He built things to last. He kept faith. Ruth stood before it for a while without speaking. The wind moved through the white oaks above, and the light came down in shifting pieces across the grass, and the mountain in its full autumn color rose behind the cemetery in every direction. The red and gold and rust of 100,000 acres of hardwood forest in its final declaration before the gray of winter. She had not known this man. She would never know him the way a daughter knows a father would not have the daily accumulation of small moments that constitutes the real knowledge of another person. What she had was the record he had left. The cabin, the journals, the letters, the carved animals, the room with the child's bed, the account from Prescott Lyle, the account in her mother's journal, the photograph on the wedding day, the fox on her windowsill. The brooch in the velvet box that she now wore pinned above her left breast where it belonged. It was not nothing. It was in fact a great deal. It was the shape of a man who had lived 102 years with intention and craft, and a faithfulness that required no audience. And the shape was enough to know him by. She drove to Staunton the following week to visit her mother's grave. Ada Kaner was buried in the municipal cemetery on the east side of town, in a section with maples and a view of the Blue Ridge that on clear days showed the ridge line above Harlan, though you would not know that was what you were seeing unless someone told you. Ruth had visited this grave every year since 2018 with flowers and silence and the specific complicated grief of a daughter who loved her mother entirely and understood her incompletely. She understood her better now. She stood at the grave with late-season asters she had cut from the cabin garden, the garden she had reclaimed from decades of overgrowth, the same beds in the same positions where Ada had planted in 1952, the soil requiring considerable amendment before it would produce anything but having responded to the work with an abundance that felt like something more than agriculture. The seeds she had found in Owen's cabin in a labeled tin on the bottom bookshelf, the labels in his handwriting. The varieties, heirloom strains that predated commercial agriculture had germinated at a rate that should have been impossible for seeds of that age. Ruth had planted them anyway, and they had grown. Things that are kept properly can outlast their expected time. She stood at her mother's grave with the asters and said what she had come to say. "I found it," she said. "All of it. The cabin and the journals and the letters and what really happened that night. I found Owen's cabin and I found the room he built for me. I found the letter you left under the porch." She paused. The wind moved through the cemetery maples, the last few leaves releasing and falling in long, slow arcs. "I understand why you ran. I understand why you stayed gone. I don't think you were right, but I understand that you were young and afraid and that you did what you did from love, and love does not make everything right, but it counts. It has to count." She placed the asters on the grave. He kept faith, Mom, all those years. He kept the room and the photographs and the carved animals. He came to Staunton when I was 15 and sat across from my school and drove home alone because he thought his presence would cost me more than his absence. He wrote your name in his journals every year on your birthday. She stopped. I think he knew you loved him. I think he always knew. She stood for a while longer. The asters were bright against the gray granite of the marker, orange and purple, the colors of a mountain autumn. Then she drove back up to the ridge. In December, Harlan Duff and his wife Vera came for dinner, the first time Ruth had cooked for anyone in the cabin since she had made the kitchen functional. She made a winter stew from the stored vegetables and the venison Harlan had brought her in November, and they ate at the handmade table by the fire and talked about the ridge and the coming winter and the particular quality of silence that this elevation produced under snow. Vera Duff was a small, precise woman who had lived on this mountain for 30 years and knew its moods the way she knew her own. She asked Ruth about the cabin's history, and Ruth told her not everything but the essential shape of it. The collective, Ada and Owen. The night it ended and what had come after. Vera listened with the focused attention of someone who understands that the stories of places are part of the place itself. That a cabin is not only its boards and stone, but everything that happened inside them. When Ruth finished, Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what strikes me? He built this cabin to hold a family, and now it does." Ruth thought about that. She looked around the room, the fireplace Owen had laid stone by stone, the floors she had brought back to their original grain, the photograph above the mantel, the fox on the kitchen window, still visible through the doorway, the 9 journals stacked on the shelf she had built against the east wall, Owen's handwriting and Ada's handwriting, and the full account of everything that had happened here preserved and present. She thought about what it meant to hold something, not to possess it. Possession was about ownership, about claiming, about the self at the center. Holding was different. Holding was what the mountain did, what Owen had done, what her mother had tried to do in the imperfect and costly way that human beings hold things. It was what Ruth was doing now, not owning the past, but holding it, keeping it present, intact, available to whatever came next. Yes, she said, I think it does. January came with snow. The first serious snow of the season arrived on a Thursday night. Ruth, lying in her sleeping bag, she had not yet bought a bed, had been meaning to, and kept putting it off in favor of other repairs, though she suspected the real reason was that the sleeping bag on the floor of the main room near the fireplace was the way she had begun her time here, and she was not yet ready to be entirely settled listening to it arrive. Not the snow itself, which was silent, but the sound of the world changing around the snow, the wind dying as the system moved over the temperature, dropping the particular quality of silence that comes when snow begins to muffle the land. She got up at 5 and looked out the window. The clearing was white and perfect, the tree line beyond it, black and white in the pre-dawn dark. The sky above the ridge already beginning to lighten from black to the gray that preceded color. She made coffee and stood on the porch in her boots and coat and held the cup in both hands and watched the ridge take shape in the growing light. She was 68 years old, and in 9 days she would be 69. She had been conceived in this cabin in the months before everything broke. Her mother had carried her south through the dark of a November night and had delivered her alone in a rented room in Eugene, Oregon, on January 14th, 1956, 14 months after fleeing Harlan Ridge, and had given her the name they had chosen together on this mountain. Her father had waited, had stayed and waited and made a room for her and carved animals for the dresser in that room and come to see her once in 1971 and had driven home alone because he decided his presence would cost her more than his absence. She She thought about what you hold on to and what you let go, and what the difference between those two actions actually is. Holding on was not the same as keeping. Owen had not kept Ada, and Ruth had not possessed them, had not tried to force his way back into their lives. He had held them the way you hold something precious that you understand might not be returned to you with care, with attention, with the willingness to wait, with the knowledge that the holding itself has value, even if what you are holding for never comes. And her mother. Her mother had held on to the cabin, had bought it back and paid taxes on it for 30 years, had buried a letter under the porch and trusted the mountain to deliver it. Had held on to the brooch, worn it hidden against her skin for 60 years, had kept it in a green velvet box that she never explained and that Ruth had kept without knowing why. Both of them holding, both of them in their different ways keeping faith with the possibility that the circle would eventually close. Ruth stood on the porch in the January cold with her coffee going cold in her cup and watched the ridge lighten from gray to the pale gold that comes just before the sun clears the peak, and understood that she was the thing they had been holding for. She was the circle closing. On the 9th day of January, Ruth walked down the hallway to the small bedroom and stood in the doorway. The room was restored, now the floor sanded and oiled. The walls painted the cream color she had found evidence of in the original paint layer beneath 40 years of grime. The child's dresser cleaned and returned to its corner. The rocking chair with its new runner placed by the window as it had always been. The carved fox sat on the dresser beside two of the other animals she had brought from Owen's cabin, the deer and the owl. On the wall above the dresser, framed in white oak, the photograph she had found in Owen's velvet box. Ada, young and unguarded, sitting in this same rocking chair in the months before Ruth was born, looking out this same window at the clearing beyond. On the windowsill, catching the thin January morning light, a small glass jar from last summer's garden holding the dried heads of wild apple blossoms gathered from the tree at the clearing's edge in June when she first arrived and pressed and kept for this. She was 69 years old today. She had been conceived in this room or in this cabin in the fall of 1954 by two people who were trying to build something real and beautiful and had the bad luck to be doing it in a decade that destroyed real and beautiful things for reasons that had nothing to do with the worth of what was being built. Ruth crossed the room and sat in the rocking chair. The new runner held. She set the chair in motion, the slow rhythm of it moving through the old floorboards Owen had laid by hand, and looked out the window at the mountain that had held all of this in its cold and patient keeping until she was ready to receive it. The snow from the previous week still lay deep in the shadows under the trees and was melting in the cleared ground where the sun reached the clearing, a patchwork of white and dark earth. A pair of ravens crossed the sky above the ridge, moving east, with the unhurried purpose of creatures who understand exactly where they are going. The creek below the clearing was audible even through the closed window, running clear and cold under its skin of ice, the way it had run in 1951 when Owen first stood in this clearing and decided this was the place, and in 1952 when Ada first arrived and stood on the porch and wrote "First Summer on the Ridge," and in every year between then and this one, regardless of what the people around it were doing and regardless of whether anyone was there to hear it. Ruth sat in the chair her father had made and looked at the photograph of her mother looking out at the mountain and let herself be in this room fully, without agenda, without the need to understand anything more than she already understood. The understanding was sufficient. She had not known her father. She would not have the years she did not have. George Kaner had been a good man who had chosen her and shown up for her life, and that was real and that counted. Owen Mercer had been a man who built rooms for people he loved and carved animals for a daughter he had never met, and kept faith for 67 years with a possibility that kept getting smaller, and who had come to see her once when she was 15 and driven home alone because he loved her enough to want what was best for her rather than what he needed. Both of those things were true. They could both be true. The heart was large enough. She rocked in the chair and let January light come through the window and thought about the spring that was coming, the garden she would plant again in the beds her mother had laid out in 1952, the seeds from Owen's cabin that had germinated against all reasonable expectation because they had been kept properly, and things that are kept properly can outlast their expected time. She thought about the 9 journals on the shelf in the main room, 67 years of one man's attention to the mountain and the forest, and the slow passage of seasons, a record she would spend years reading and thinking of, and eventually she had decided contributing to some form of public archive, where the history of the Harlan Ridge Collective could be told accurately without the frame the federal government had built around it in December 1954. She thought about Prescott Lyle, who came to the library on Wednesdays because he had been waiting since his 40s for someone who needed what he carried, and Birch Pruitt in Tennessee, who had gone to Warren Fossey's funeral in 2003 because it was the right thing to do, and because the closing of things that should be closed was itself a kind of work worth doing. And Harlan Duff, with his bolt cutter and his truck and his 30 years of quiet neighborliness to a man he understood, was waiting for something without ever being told what. People helped, even in the absence of explanation, even when the shape of what was needed was not visible from the outside. The mountain did not accomplish what it had accomplished alone. It had required people who showed up without being asked and offered what they had. She had come from this mountain. This mountain had been waiting for her. The snow outside the window was melting at its edges in the January sun, the clearing slowly reclaiming its dark earth from the white, the way things reclaim themselves after a long interruption gradually from the edges inward, the original surface revealed bit by bit as the covering withdraws. Ruth rocked in the chair and was for the first time in many years entirely at peace with where she was and who she was and what had brought her here. Outside, the Blue Ridge held its long winter light with the unhurried certainty of something that had always been there and intended to remain. The creek ran. The ravens had gone east. The clearing was quiet in the particular way that a place is quiet when it is finally being used for what it was made for. The fox sat on the dresser with the deer and the owl. 3 small, precise objects in a room that had been waiting for 67 years, made with the hands of a man who kept faith long past the point where most people would have stopped, who understood that good work was its own argument against time. Ruth Kaner was a daughter. She understood that now in the full and specific sense, not the biographical fact of it, which she had always known, but the actual meaning of it. She had come from 2 people who had loved each other and built something together and been separated by fear and history, and the small catastrophic decisions that changed the shape of everything downstream. She had lived 68 years of a real and full life on the foundation of that love without knowing the foundation had a name. She knew the name now. She knew both names. She sat in the rocking chair her father had made and looked out the window at the mountain her parents had both loved, one from close and one from a great and painful distance, and let the morning come in through the glass and fall across her hands and across the old floorboards and across the small glass jar of dried apple blossoms on the windowsill. This was her home. Not the place she had grown up, not the apartment in Staunton, not the house in Harrisonburg where she had lived with Jack for 20 years, and which had become after his death a place she could not make herself stay in. This room, this cabin, this clearing, this ridge, these mountains that had kept everything in their cold and patient keeping until she arrived to receive it. The walls were on her side. They had always been on her side. Owen had built them that way with that intention, and that intention had held through 70 years of neglect and weather and the slow erosion of everything except the bones, which were good, which were always good, which were old-growth timber dried to a density that outlasted the circumstances that had tried to end what had been built here. Some things take 68 years to arrive when they
they arrive, they are worth the wait.
The morning deepened. The sun cleared the ridge and the light changed from pale gold to the full brightness of a winter day, sharp and clear and cold, the kind of light that shows you exactly what is there without softening or concealment. Ruth looked at everything in the room in that light. The fox, the deer, the owl, the chair, the dresser, the photograph of her mother looking out at the mountain, the dried blossoms on the windowsill, and felt no need to look away from any of it. She was home, and the home was solid, and the walls were on her side. And outside the window the ridge held its long winter light, with the unhurried certainty of something that had always been there and intended to remain.